Jody Huber lives in the fine St. Paul neighborhood of Marion Park. Although she grew up in Duluth, she spent years away in Houston, Texas, and Edmonton, Alberta, before she came to her senses and returned to Minnesota. She is a freelance advertising copywriter who loves to read just about anything, with a penchant toward female fiction writers from Great Britain, India, and Russia. Please welcome Jody.
Thank you for coming out. I was asked by the Almanac to write about St. Paul as it shows up in books and about the people and the places that we read about in St. Paul. So I chose some of my favorites to write about, and I'm sure you all have your favorites, so I'll just read a few of them. St. Paul is a wonderful town. It's put together in solid blocks of honest brick and stone and has the air of intending to stay. This from none other than Mark Twain in Life on the Mississippi. 98 years later, a fellow Mississippi River traveler, Jonathan Raven, offers up his observations in Old Glory, An American Voyage. In the violet light, the riverfront of St. Paul had the pretty decrepitude of a European city. Its dusky brickwork floated in long reflection on the water. It looked frosty, aged, and likable. But that's not all he offers up, observation-wise. While in St. Paul, he ends up at the Minnesota State Fair. British-born, he'd not been to a state fair, any state fair. So we're hearing him describe it in rather bewildered detail on a Labor Day, mind you. He marvels at all the sloganed caps, at first thinking John Deere was a cap wearer's name, till he saw hundreds more. The size of the food, the snowblower demonstrations. Here's his first impression. The State Fair, at first glance, it did indeed look like a city under occupation by an army of rampaging Goths. St. Paul passes through these gentlemen, but I like that outsider take on us. Of course, there are those who chose to take a longer, closer look at our town, including those who spent their formative years here. Enter you-know-who. No surprise that a special section is devoted to F. Scott Fitzgerald in St. Paul's Central Library. It's in the magazine room, where you can settle into a cushy chair and immerse yourself in a choice of all things F. Scott. But for pure local color, just go straight for the St. Paul stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald. And while Sinclair Lewis's novels don't revolve around St. Paul, protagonist Carol Milford in Main Street was in charge of, get this, the magazine room of the Central Library. Of course, she then marries Dr. Will Kennicott and becomes perfectly miserable in Gopher Prairie in the end, but I digress. Small towns and narrow minds were Lewis's fort, a milieu I find delicious. And besides, how can I not mention the first American and only Minnesotan to win the Nobel Prize in Literature? Gordon Parks, most know him for his evocative photography, as can be seen in his retrospective Half Past Autumn. But what a writer. His autobiography, A Choice of Weapons, opens with his move to St. Paul as a teenager in 1928. I stepped onto the chilly streets of St. Paul. I had never met my brother-in-law. His handshake told me that I was to be tolerated rather than accepted. It unfolds, and I'm not even doing it justice, with all the suspense and harrowing tension of a thriller. Yet he not only survived his own life, but what he left for ours. Documenting contemporary life in St. Paul is photographer Wing Young Huey. His wonderful neighborhoody photos are engaging and fully fleshed out by narrative. Sometimes these narratives are his own thoughts. For several blocks, I didn't see anyone. It seemed as though everyone was hiding. But then I turned a corner and was struck by the sight of a melange of families all on the same block, Asian, black, and white, out on their respective porches enjoying the day. And sometimes the thoughts were those of his subjects. But you really feel you get to know who lives in these neighborhoods as you page through Frogtown and University Avenue Project. And I love how Patricia Hampel recalls growing up here in the 60s with this excerpt from her St. Luke's school days from a romantic education. "What are you?" someone would ask, and each little girl answered promptly, "I'm Norwegian, I'm German," or the most frequent reply, "I'm Irish." Occasionally there was a rebel, "I'm American." This was frowned upon and considered an affectation. "I mean, what are you really?" someone would ask impatiently. If you're looking for dead-on recognizable characters from these here parts, they'd be in The Tomcat's Wife and Backbone, short stories by Carol Blythe. Mostly from smaller towns, characters often refer to the Twin Cities in that small-town Minnesota way. I can vouch for this. The cities, going to the cities, just got back from the cities. The cities were Minneapolis and St. Paul lumped, no distinction. Truth is, it often just meant Minneapolis. But there you are, spoken of as one. And The Boy's House by Jim Haynen. A more delightful read in one sitting book I cannot tell you. Short, really short stories that begin like this. "People in America don't know anything about water," said the boy's grandfather, who had moved from Holland when he was a young man. The boys liked it when he visited because he always had a story to tell, and it was usually about something that was wrong with America. Thank you. I just want to conclude with a small piece. Now, this is not about Minnesota, but close enough. It's in Wisconsin. And it kind of reflects my love of odd people and odd things. I find squirrels and chipmunks interesting. Come on, animals routinely chattering, scolding, scooting around and throwing things are interesting. However, it's never occurred to me to pick up a dead squirrel or chipmunk off the road and put it in a little sundress or a leather jacket and prop it up in a little scene with others. Like this guy I'm going to tell you about from Madison, Wisconsin. I read about San Filippo in a book called Weird Wisconsin. He's the retired owner and funeral director of the Crest Funeral Home, now also the home of his Squirrel and Chipmunk Museum. They're all propped up in little detailed tableaux. Some are in tiny outfits, mainly the females, from what I can tell by the description and some of the photos. Sam had some kind of arrangement worked out with the city workers who pick up roadkill in Madison. Apparently, he requested the less flattened ones to be sent to the funeral home. He's got one labeled Louis Bar and Grill. In it is a chipmunk smoking a cigarette, sitting on a beer bottle cap bar stool. 4 chipmunks are on a little merry-go-round holding balloons and cotton candy. He's got an entire albino squirrel section. He gets these little dead guys from elsewhere because as albino squirrels are not prevalent enough in Madison to routinely get hit by cars. There's a couple in a Barbie dream car, which Sam painted a hot fuchsia to, as he says, match their tiny pink eyes. One on a tricycle, one on a plastic horse, in a Jeep, one in a dune buggy. But the one that seems to be really a pride and joy is the elaborate bar scene where a poker game is going on. Gray squirrels and a single chipmunk, all seated around a tiny poker table and handmade chairs playing with tiny cards. Nearby, a squirrel playing a tiny baby grand piano in front of a smoked mirror. The squirrels at the bar are sitting on tiny red bar stools, and the bar itself is well stocked. But I guess what I like best is that there's a tiny moose head on the wall. I thought about tableau I would set up, like a squirrel at one of those self-checking blood pressure machines at grocery stores, or a squirrel getting his taxes done at an H&R Block office, or a chipmunk in charge of shoe rental at a bowling alley. Although for some reason, I think a chipmunk installing kitchen cabinets sounds funnier to me than it looks. A visit to Sam's Squirrel and Chipmunk Museum is free and you can go almost any time. That is, any time a funeral is not scheduled. Thank you.